The church doors were still open when Charlotte Bennet heard the words that would end her old life forever. "I cannot marry you. You are worthless to me." The voice belonged to Edmund Caro, the man she had been engaged to for 11 months. He said it loud enough for every guest in the packed church to hear. Charlotte stood frozen in her white gown, her hands still holding a bouquet of pale roses, as 300 faces turned to stare at her. For a moment she could not breathe. The organ music had stopped. The priest looked down at his book, unsure what to do. Somewhere near the back, a child laughed, not understanding what was happening, and the sound cut through the silence like a small knife. Edmund straightened his jacket and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is finished with. "Your family's land was the only reason I agreed to this. Now that my father has secured a better arrangement, I no longer need you or your name." Charlotte felt her face grow hot, then cold. She looked at the crowd. She saw her aunt covering her mouth. She saw her father's business partner whispering to his wife. She saw pity, and worse, she saw amusement on some faces, as if her heartbreak were a show put on for their entertainment. She had spent months preparing for this day. She had practiced her vows in front of a mirror. She had picked flowers that matched her mother's old wedding portrait. None of that mattered now. In front of everyone she knew, she had just been called worthless. She did not cry. She would not give him that. Instead, Charlotte set the bouquet down gently on the nearest pew, as if she were simply finished holding it. Her hands did not shake, though her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. She lifted the edge of her gown so it would not catch under her shoes, and she turned around. She did not look back at Edmund. She did not look at the priest. She walked straight down the aisle, past every whispering face, past every raised eyebrow, and out through the open doors of the church. The autumn air outside was sharp and cold against her skin. It felt like the first real thing she had felt in days. Charlotte stood on the stone steps for a moment, blinking in the sudden brightness, trying to decide where to go. She had no home to return to that would not soon be filled with gossip. She had no carriage waiting, since the one she arrived in belonged to Edmund's family. She had nothing but the dress on her back and the ache in her chest. She took a breath and started down the steps, moving quickly, wanting only to be far away from the church before the doors opened again, and the crowd spilled out to watch her walk away in shame. She was not looking where she was going. Her eyes were fixed on the street ahead, blurred with unshed tears she refused to let fall. That was why she did not see the man stepping out of a carriage that had just pulled up at the base of the steps. Charlotte walked directly into him. The impact was enough to knock the breath from her, and she stumbled, certain she was about to fall onto the stone steps in front of everyone. But 2 strong hands caught her by the shoulders before she could hit the ground. She looked up, startled, straight into a pair of steady gray eyes that did not look away. "Careful," the man said, his voice calm, almost amused, though there was concern behind it. "The street was not going anywhere. You did not need to run at it." Charlotte pulled back, embarrassed, brushing at her skirts even though nothing was wrong with them. "I am sorry. I was not paying attention." The man studied her for a moment. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat far finer than anything most men in town could afford, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having to prove himself to anyone. His carriage, waiting behind him, bore a crest she recognized but could not immediately place. Then his eyes moved past her, toward the church doors, where the first guests were beginning to spill out into the afternoon light, their voices already rising with excited chatter. He looked back at her torn expression, at the wedding gown, at the absence of a groom beside her, and understanding crossed his face. "You are the bride," he said quietly. It was not a question. Charlotte lifted her chin, refusing to let her voice shake. "I was. It seems the wedding has been canceled." "By whom?" "By the groom." In front of everyone, she managed a thin, humorless smile. It was quite a memorable speech. The stranger did not laugh, and he did not offer false sympathy, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Instead, he glanced again at the crowd now gathering on the steps, several of them already pointing toward her, their voices rising with excitement at the sight of fresh scandal. "You should not stand here," he said simply, "unless you enjoy being stared at." "I do not." "Then come." He gestured toward his carriage. "I will take you somewhere quiet away from all of this until you decide what you would like to do next." Charlotte hesitated. She did not know this man. She had no idea who he truly was, only that his clothes and his carriage suggested wealth, and that his manner suggested he was used to being obeyed. And yet, standing there on those church steps with 300 people beginning to whisper her name, she realized she had nothing left to lose by trusting a stranger for a single carriage ride. "Who are you?" she asked. "Alexander Ravensworth," he said. "Some call me the Duke of Ashford Hall, though I find the title tiresome most days." Charlotte blinked. She had heard the name before, whispered in drawing rooms and printed in society papers, always attached to rumors of a reclusive nobleman who rarely appeared at public events, and had turned down more marriage proposals than any man in the country. She had never expected to meet him, and certainly never like this, standing in a ruined wedding gown with her whole future collapsing around her. "I did not expect a duke to be attending my wedding," she said. "I was not attending it. I was passing through town and heard there would be a wedding worth watching. It seems I arrived just in time to watch something far more interesting than vows." Despite everything, despite the humiliation still burning in her chest, Charlotte felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. There was something disarming about his honesty, the way he did not pretend the situation was anything other than what it was. Behind them, the crowd was growing louder. She heard her aunt calling her name, heard Edmund's voice rising above the others, defending himself to anyone who would listen. She did not want to face any of it, not yet, not while her hands were still shaking and her thoughts were still a tangled mess. "Very well," she said, and let him help her into the carriage. As the door closed and the wheels began to turn, carrying her away from the church, from the crowd, from the life she had expected to have, Charlotte allowed herself, for the first time that day, to breathe. She did not know where this carriage was taking her. She did not know what would come next, or how she would explain any of this to her family, or how she would rebuild a life that had just been torn apart in front of everyone she knew. But sitting across from a stranger who called himself a duke, watching the town blur past the window, she felt something she had not expected to feel on what was supposed to be her wedding day. She felt free. The carriage rolled steadily through the narrow streets, leaving behind the noise of the church and the crowd that had gathered to witness her humiliation. Charlotte kept her eyes on the window, watching the familiar shops and houses pass by, trying to steady her breathing. Beside her, Alexander said nothing for a long while, allowing the silence to settle between them like a soft blanket. It was Charlotte who finally spoke. "You must think me foolish, running headlong into a stranger's carriage on the worst day of my life. I think you were trying very hard not to fall apart in front of 300 people," Alexander said. "That does not sound foolish to me. It sounds like the only sensible thing to do." She glanced at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone, so different from the cold amusement she had expected from a man of his reputation. The papers described him as distant, unreadable, uninterested in the games that occupied most of society. Sitting across from him now, she found none of that unkindness in his face, only a quiet steadiness that made her feel, oddly, less alone. "May I ask why you were truly at the church?" she said. "You said you heard there would be a wedding worth watching, but that cannot be the whole truth." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My cousin insisted I attend. She thought it might do me good to see a happy occasion since I attend so few of them. I told her I would come for an hour out of politeness, and then leave before anyone noticed me." "Well, you were noticed by me, quite literally." A faint smile crossed his face, there and then gone. "So I was." The carriage slowed as it reached a quieter part of town, away from the bustling streets near the church. Charlotte realized she had no idea where they were going, and for the first time since she had climbed inside, a flicker of uncertainty rose in her chest. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Wherever you wish to go," Alexander said. I only assumed you would not want to return to a house full of relatives asking questions you are not ready to answer. If I am wrong, tell me, and I will take you home immediately." Charlotte considered this. He was right, of course. Her family's house would be filled with gossip before nightfall, with neighbors arriving under the pretense of comfort but hungry for details. She could not face that yet, not with her thoughts still in pieces. "I do not know where I want to go," she admitted quietly. "I had a whole life planned for today, and none of it involved sitting in a duke's carriage with nowhere to be." "Then let me offer a suggestion. There is a small tea house near the river, quiet, rarely crowded. We can stop there, and you can decide what comes next without an audience watching your every move." She nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the offer. "Thank you." The tea house was exactly as he described, tucked along a quiet street with large windows overlooking the slow-moving river. Only a handful of other guests sat scattered at the tables, none of them paying attention to the woman still wearing a wedding gown beneath a borrowed coat Alexander had draped over her shoulders before they entered. They sat near the window, and for a while neither of them spoke. Charlotte wrapped her hands around a warm cup of tea, letting the heat seep into her fingers, still cold from the shock of the morning. Alexander watched her quietly, giving her the space she needed before finally breaking the silence. "You do not have to tell me anything," he said, "but if it would help to speak of it, I am willing to listen." Charlotte let out a slow breath. "There is not much to tell that you did not already hear. Edmund's family needed money. My family owns land that borders theirs, land that would have made his father's holdings twice as large. That is the only reason he proposed to me in the first place. I thought, foolishly, that perhaps he had grown to care for me over these past months. It seems his father found a wealthier arrangement, and I became unnecessary." "That is not foolishness," Alexander said. "That is simply trust, given to someone who did not deserve it. Trust that made me look like a fool in front of everyone I know." "The fool in that church was not you," Alexander said, his voice firm now, carrying none of the careless amusement from earlier. "A man who humiliates a woman publicly to justify his own greed is the only fool in that story. Everyone watching understood that, whether or not they said so out loud." Charlotte studied him, searching for any sign that he was simply saying what she wanted to hear, the way people often did to comfort someone in pain. But his expression remained steady, sincere, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the sight of it. "You are very direct for a duke," she said. "I thought men of your position spoke only in careful riddles." "I have little patience for riddles," Alexander said. "Especially not today, watching a man call a woman worthless in front of a church full of witnesses when it is clear she is nothing of the sort." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, though this time it was not from shame. She looked down at her tea, unsure how to respond to such plain kindness after a day that had offered her none. They sat together as the afternoon light shifted through the windows, talking quietly about small, unimportant things, giving Charlotte's racing thoughts a chance to slow. She learned that Alexander had inherited his title young, after his father's sudden passing, and had spent the years since managing the estate quietly, avoiding the social circles that seemed to delight in his misfortune and his solitude. She learned he rarely attended events like weddings, preferring the company of his books and his horses to crowded ballrooms filled with people seeking favor. "You must think my life very small in comparison to yours," Charlotte said at one point, half joking. "I think your life, until this morning, sounded a great deal more honest than most of the lives lived in the circles I am forced to move through," Alexander said. "People there rarely say what they mean. You, it seems, are surrounded by people who say exactly what they mean, even when it is cruel." Charlotte laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first real laugh she had managed all day. That is one way to look at it. As the sky outside began to shift toward evening, Alexander finally asked the question that had been sitting quietly between them since they left the church. "What will you do now, Charlotte? You cannot stay in this tea house forever, as pleasant as the company might be." She considered the question seriously, aware that her answer would shape whatever came next. Her family's finances, she now understood, had been resting on the promise of Edmund's marriage settlement, a promise that no longer existed. Returning home meant facing not only embarrassment but the very real problem of an uncertain future. "I truly do not know," she admitted. "My family's situation was tied to this marriage in ways I am only beginning to understand. Without it, I am not certain what remains for us." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, turning his teacup slowly in his hands, as though weighing something carefully before speaking it aloud. "I have a proposal," he said finally. "Not the kind you were expecting today, and not one built on romance or grand promises, a practical one." Charlotte raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was leading. "I am listening." "My family has spent years pressing me to marry, insisting that a duke without a wife invites gossip and scheming relatives eager to claim influence over my estate. I have resisted for exactly that reason, unwilling to marry simply to satisfy expectations. But perhaps there is a version of that arrangement that could benefit us both." "You are suggesting marriage," Charlotte said slowly, testing the shape of the word after everything that had just happened to her. "A marriage of convenience," Alexander clarified. "Nothing more than that, unless in time it became something more. It would secure your position, silence any scandal from today, and give my family one less thing to interfere with. In return, I ask only companionship and honesty, the same honesty you have shown me this afternoon." Charlotte sat back, stunned by the suddenness of the offer, though she could not deny a strange sense of calm settling over her as she considered it. It was not romantic, not what she had imagined for herself as a young girl dreaming of weddings. But it was honest, offered without pretense, by a man who had shown her more kindness in a single afternoon than Edmund had shown her in 11 months. "I do not know you," she said carefully. "No," Alexander agreed. "But you know more of my character after this one afternoon than you knew of his after 11 months, it seems." She could not argue with that. "I need time to think," Charlotte said finally. "Take all the time you need," Alexander replied. "There is no urgency in my offer, only sincerity. Whatever you decide, I will see that you are returned safely to wherever you wish to go tonight." As the carriage carried her away from the tea-house later that evening, Charlotte watched the town lights begin to glow against the darkening sky, and found herself thinking not of the humiliation at the altar, but of the steady gray eyes of a man who had caught her when she fell, and offered her a future when she believed she had none left. Charlotte did not sleep that night. She sat by the window of the small guest room her aunt had reluctantly prepared for her, watching the moon move slowly across the sky, turning Alexander's offer over and over in her mind. By morning, she had made her decision, though it surprised even her how quickly she had reached it. She sent word to Ashford Hall that she wished to speak with the Duke again. Alexander received her in a quiet study lined with books, a fire crackling gently in the hearth despite the mild autumn weather outside. He rose when she entered, his expression careful, giving nothing away, though she thought she saw a flicker of something hopeful in his eyes before he masked it. "You came quickly," he said. "I did not expect an answer so soon." "I did not see the point in waiting," Charlotte said, taking the seat he offered. "My family's situation will not improve with time, and neither will the gossip surrounding yesterday. If your offer still stands, I accept it." Alexander studied her for a long moment, as though searching for hesitation or regret hidden beneath her steady voice. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Then we are agreed," he said. "I will speak with your father this afternoon and begin arrangements. I must warn you, Charlotte, that my family will not receive this news with grace. My cousin, in particular, has long hoped that my resistance to marriage meant an opening for her own daughter. She will not be pleased to learn I have chosen someone else, and certainly not someone who arrived at my door in a wedding gown meant for another man." "I have already survived one humiliation this week," Charlotte said, managing a small, wry smile. "I imagine I can survive the disapproval of a cousin I have never met." "I admire your confidence," Alexander said, "though I suspect Lady Margaret Locksley will test it more than you expect." Charlotte did not yet understand how right he was. The arrangements moved quickly after that. Her father, still shaken by the events at the church, was relieved beyond words to learn that his daughter's future had been secured through a match far grander than the one that had just collapsed. If he suspected the marriage lacked the romance Charlotte had once dreamed of, he said nothing of it, too grateful for the sudden reversal of fortune to question its foundations. Within 2 weeks, Charlotte found herself standing before a much smaller gathering than the one that had witnessed her humiliation, exchanging vows with a man she barely knew, in a ceremony far quieter and far more private than the disaster that had preceded it. There were no crowds this time, no whispers rising through a packed church. Only a handful of witnesses, the priest's steady voice, and Alexander's calm hand closing around hers as they made their promises. It did not feel like the wedding she had once imagined for herself. But standing there, looking into the same steady gray eyes that had caught her when she stumbled outside that church, Charlotte felt something she had not expected to feel again so soon. She felt safe. That evening, as the carriage carried them toward Ashford Hall, Charlotte watched the countryside change from familiar town streets to wide, rolling fields she had never seen before. The estate rose ahead of them as the sun began to set, its stone walls catching the last golden light, larger and grander than anything she had imagined living in. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. "It has been in my family for 4 generations," Alexander said. "I hope, in time, it will feel like home to you as well, not simply a place you were brought to escape a scandal." Charlotte turned to look at him, surprised by the quiet vulnerability in his voice, so different from the confident stranger who had caught her on the church steps. "I intend to make it feel that way," she said. "If you will let me." He held her gaze for a long moment before answering, "I would like that very much." The carriage rolled through the gates, and Charlotte stepped down into her new life, unaware of the challenges waiting for her within those grand stone walls, or of the woman already watching her arrival from an upstairs window with narrowed, calculating eyes. The woman at the window was Margaret Locksley, Alexander's cousin, and she did not bother to hide her displeasure when Charlotte was introduced to the household the following morning. Margaret had lived at Ashford Hall for the better part of a year, managing small details of the estate in Alexander's absence, and had long assumed that her own daughter, still too young for marriage but growing closer each year, would one day inherit both the title and the influence that came with it. Charlotte's sudden arrival threatened all of that, and Margaret made no effort to disguise her cold politeness during their first meeting in the drawing room. "How fortunate," Margaret said, her smile thin and practiced, "that the Duke found a bride so quickly and under such unusual circumstances. I understand you arrived at his door still wearing another man's wedding gown." "I arrived wearing my own gown," Charlotte corrected calmly, refusing to let the comment unsettle her. "The man simply forgot he had promised to marry me in it." A flicker of surprise crossed Margaret's face at the steady response, quickly replaced by the same tight smile. "How resourceful of you, then, to secure a duke so soon after." Alexander, standing nearby, stepped forward before the conversation could sharpen further. "Margaret, Charlotte is not simply resourceful. She is my wife, and I expect her to be treated with the same respect given to any member of this family." Margaret's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes hardened. "Of course, Your Grace, I only meant to welcome her." The tension in the room did not go unnoticed by the household staff gathered nearby, several of whom exchanged quiet glances before returning to their duties. Charlotte understood in that moment that her welcome at Ashford Hall would not come easily, and that Margaret would not surrender her position of influence without a fight. Despite this rocky beginning, Charlotte found unexpected comfort in the days that followed among the staff who worked within the grand halls of the estate. Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly housekeeper who had served the family for over 30 years, took an immediate liking to Charlotte's quiet kindness, offering guidance on the household's routines without the coldness Margaret displayed. "Do not mind Lady Margaret too much," Mrs. Pemberton told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the estate's expansive gardens. She has grown used to a certain amount of influence here, and change does not sit easily with people like her. Give it time. The staff already speak well of you, and that matters more than you might think." Charlotte appreciated the honesty, and she took the advice to heart, focusing her energy on learning the estate's rhythms rather than engaging in Margaret's quiet games of superiority. She spent mornings walking the grounds with the head gardener, learning the names of flowers she had never seen before. She spent afternoons in the kitchens, much to the surprise of the cooking staff, asking questions about the meals prepared for the household rather than simply issuing commands from a distance. Word of her gentle manner spread quickly among the servants, and within weeks, the cold formality that had greeted her upon arrival began to soften into something warmer. Alexander noticed the change as well, watching quietly from a distance as his new wife settled into a life that had once felt distant and cold to him. He found himself seeking her company more often than he expected, drawn not by obligation, but by genuine curiosity about the woman who had walked into his life so unexpectedly. One evening, several weeks into their marriage, he found her in the estate's library, curled into a chair by the fire with one of his father's old books open across her lap. "You have found my father's collection," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I hope you do not mind," Charlotte said. "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned you rarely come in here anymore." "I do not mind at all," Alexander said. "It has felt empty in here for a long time. It is good to see it used again." They fell into easy conversation that night, the kind that stretched long past the hour either of them intended to stay awake, discussing books and childhood memories and small, ordinary things that slowly built a bridge between two people who had begun their marriage as strangers. Charlotte found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, and Alexander found himself watching her laugh with a warmth he had not expected to feel again after years of guarding himself against disappointment. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Charlotte finally asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since their first meeting. "Why did you never marry before now?" she asked. "A duke, unmarried well past the usual age, avoiding society whenever possible. There must be a reason beyond simple preference." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire before answering. "I was engaged once, years ago, to a woman named Isabel Fenwick. I believed, foolishly, that she loved me for who I was rather than what I could offer her. I learned otherwise only weeks before our wedding, when I discovered she had been quietly negotiating a larger settlement with another suitor behind my back, using our engagement only to raise her price." "I am sorry," Charlotte said softly. "It taught me caution," Alexander continued. "I stopped trusting easily after that. Every woman my family introduced me to afterward seemed interested only in the title, never in the man beneath it. I preferred solitude to the exhausting effort of guessing which was which." "And yet you offered marriage to a stranger you met on a church staircase," Charlotte said gently. A small smile crossed his face. "Perhaps because you were the first woman I had met in years who was not trying to impress me. You were simply trying to survive a terrible day, and something about that honesty reminded me what genuine company felt like." Charlotte felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, something far gentler than the practical arrangement they had agreed to weeks earlier. She had not expected to feel anything beyond gratitude toward this man who had rescued her from disaster, and yet sitting here now, watching the firelight dance across his thoughtful expression, she recognized the quiet beginnings of something she had not felt even during her engagement to Edmund. Their conversation was interrupted, gently but firmly, by Mrs. Pemberton arriving to inform them of an urgent letter that had just arrived for the Duke. Alexander excused himself reluctantly, promising to continue their conversation another evening, and Charlotte watched him go with a strange, unfamiliar flutter in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely that night. She did not yet know that the letter carried news that would soon bring her past crashing back into her present, in the form of a man she had hoped never to see again. The letter had come from Edmund Caro. Alexander read it twice in the privacy of his study, his jaw tightening with each line. Edmund's family, it seemed, had fared far worse in their new arrangement than they had anticipated. The wealthier match Edmund's father had chosen over Charlotte's land had collapsed within months, leaving the family deeply in debt and desperate for any solution that might restore their fortunes. Edmund, humiliated and increasingly desperate, had learned of Charlotte's sudden marriage to a duke, and saw in it an opportunity too tempting to ignore. The letter did not ask outright for money. It hinted, carefully worded, at old letters Charlotte had once written him during their engagement, private words meant only for a man she believed she would marry, now twisted into something that could be used to embarrass her new husband if she did not agree to a quiet arrangement to buy his silence. Alexander felt anger rise in his chest, unlike anything he had experienced in years. He did not show the letter to Charlotte immediately, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace they had built together, but he could not ignore the threat sitting quietly in his desk drawer either. He was not the only one aware of Edmund's scheming, however. Margaret Locksley had intercepted enough whispers among the household staff to piece together that something troubling had arrived by letter, and her sharp mind immediately recognized an opportunity of her own. If Charlotte's past could be used to weaken her position within the family, perhaps it could also weaken her hold on Alexander, clearing the path Margaret had once believed belonged to her daughter. She wasted no time seeking Edmund out. Their meeting took place discreetly, in a private room of a tea house far from Ashford Hall, where neither would risk being seen together by anyone connected to the family. Margaret laid out her proposal plainly, without wasting time on pleasantries. "You want money to settle your family's debts," she said. "I want the Duke free of his current wife so that a more suitable match can take her place. Our goals are not so different, Mr. Caro." Edmund studied her carefully, weighing the offer. "You want me to expose her, then, publicly, the way I already did once?" "I want you to remind everyone, at the right moment in front of the right people, exactly what kind of woman the Duke has married," Margaret said. "Let the scandal do the rest. Society rarely forgives a woman twice." Edmund considered this for a long moment before a slow, calculating smile spread across his face. "There is a ball being held in 3 weeks, celebrating the Duke's marriage formally before society. Half the country's nobility will be present." "Then that is where it happens," Margaret said. Neither of them noticed the young kitchen maid who had been sent to deliver refreshments to a nearby table, close enough to overhear fragments of their conversation before hurrying back toward the estate, uncertain what she had just witnessed, but certain it needed to be reported. Charlotte learned of the conversation 2 days later, when Mrs. Pemberton quietly relayed what the maid had overheard, careful to keep her voice low even within the privacy of Charlotte's own sitting room. "I do not know the full details," Mrs. Pemberton admitted, but the girl was certain she heard Lady Margaret's voice, and a man's voice discussing a ball, and something about reminding people what kind of woman you are. "I thought you should know, Your Grace, before anything is decided without you." Charlotte felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as the pieces fell into place. She thanked Mrs. Pemberton for her honesty and sat alone for a long while afterward, staring out at the gardens she had grown fond of over the past weeks, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She confronted Alexander that evening, the letter he had been keeping hidden finally brought into the open between them. "You should have told me immediately," Charlotte said, though there was more hurt than anger in her voice. "I deserve to know." "I did not want to burden you with it until I understood the full extent of the threat," Alexander admitted. "I was wrong to keep it from you. I am sorry." Charlotte studied the letter carefully, reading Edmund's careful, threatening words for herself. Anger rose in her chest, sharper than the shame she had felt on her wedding day, because this time it was not simply about being called worthless. It was about being used still, even after everything, as a tool for other people's ambitions. "They mean to embarrass us both at the ball," she said quietly. "Margaret hopes it will end our marriage. Edmund hopes it will earn him money to save his family's fortune." "They will not succeed," Alexander said firmly. "How can you be certain?" "Because this time," Alexander said, taking her hand gently in his, "you will not be standing alone. Whatever they intend to say, whatever old letters they intend to twist, we will face it together in front of everyone and let them see exactly how little power their scheming truly holds over us." Charlotte looked up at him, searching his steady gray eyes for any trace of doubt, and found none. For the first time since the humiliation at the church, she did not feel fear at the thought of facing a crowded room of judging faces. She felt instead a quiet determination settling into her chest, matched by the steady presence of the man beside her. "Then let them try," she said. Over the following weeks, as the ball drew closer, Charlotte and Alexander grew closer as well, bound together not only by the practical arrangement that had begun their marriage, but by a shared purpose that deepened into something far more genuine. Late evenings in the library became a nightly habit rather than an occasional pleasure. Quiet conversations over breakfast stretched longer than either of them intended. Small gestures of care, a shared umbrella during an unexpected rain shower, a steadying hand during a difficult ride through the estate's woods, built a foundation of trust neither of them had expected to find so quickly. Margaret watched this growing closeness with increasing frustration, her carefully laid plans threatened by a bond she had not anticipated forming between two people she believed had married for nothing more than convenience. She doubled her efforts with Edmund, meeting with him twice more in the weeks leading up to the ball, refining their plan to ensure maximum damage when the moment finally arrived. Neither of them realized that Charlotte and Alexander were no longer simply preparing to defend themselves. They were preparing, together, to turn the entire scheme back against the people who had created it. The night of the ball arrived with a clear sky and a chill in the autumn air, the kind of evening that seemed almost too peaceful for what Charlotte knew was coming. Ashford Hall had been transformed for the occasion, its grand ballroom lit with hundreds of candles, its halls filled with the low hum of arriving guests eager to see the reclusive Duke's new bride for themselves. Charlotte stood before the mirror in her chambers, dressed in deep blue silk that Alexander had chosen for her himself, insisting she deserved something as striking as the woman who would wear it. She studied her reflection carefully, searching for any trace of the frightened bride who had fled a church in ruins months earlier. She found none. The woman looking back at her stood tall, calm, and unafraid. Alexander appeared in the doorway, dressed formally for the evening, and paused when he saw her, something warm and unguarded crossing his face before he composed himself. "You look remarkable," he said quietly. "I feel remarkably nervous," Charlotte admitted, managing a small smile despite the tightness in her chest. "That is understandable," Alexander said, crossing the room to stand beside her. "But remember, whatever they intend to say tonight, you are not the same woman who walked out of that church alone. You are not walking into this room alone either." Charlotte nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence, and together they made their way toward the grand staircase leading down into the crowded ballroom below. The evening began smoothly enough, filled with polite introductions and careful conversation as guests from across the country gathered to observe the Duke's new wife firsthand. Charlotte handled the attention with practiced grace, answering questions about her background honestly, but briefly, refusing to let curious guests draw more from her than she intended to share. It was near midnight, as the dancing reached its peak and the candles had burned low, that Margaret made her move. She approached a cluster of prominent guests near the refreshment table, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the surrounding conversations, though careful enough to seem accidental rather than deliberate. "It is remarkable, is it not," Margaret said, "how quickly the Duchess secured her position here, considering the circumstances of her previous engagement. I understand there are rather personal letters still circulating from that time, letters that paint quite a different picture than the composed woman standing before us tonight." Heads turned, conversations paused. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten as she realized the moment had finally arrived, exactly as she and Alexander had anticipated during their weeks of preparation. Before Margaret could continue, a familiar voice cut through the crowd from the ballroom's entrance. Edmund Caro had arrived, uninvited, dressed in clothes slightly too fine for a man whose family fortune had collapsed. clearly hoping to make a dramatic entrance that would support Margaret's carefully planted rumors. He crossed the room with practiced confidence, several folded letters visible in his hand, ready to complete the humiliation he and Margaret had planned together. "Forgive the interruption," Edmund announced, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. "But I believe there are things this gathering deserves to know about the woman the Duke has chosen to marry." Charlotte felt every eye in the room turn toward her, the familiar weight of public judgment settling over her shoulders exactly as it had on her wedding day. But this time, she did not feel the urge to flee. This time, she felt Alexander's hand find hers, steady and sure, and she felt something else entirely. She felt ready. "Please," Alexander said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the silent room. "Do share, Mr. Caro. I believe everyone here would find your explanation quite illuminating, particularly regarding your own recent financial troubles, and the rather desperate letter you sent to my estate several weeks ago attempting to extort money from my wife using those very same letters you now hold." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the crowd. Edmund's confident expression faltered slightly, though he pressed forward, holding up the letters as though they still held the power he had counted on. "These letters prove nothing beyond a young woman's private thoughts," Edmund said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Then let us examine them together," Alexander said, stepping forward calmly. "Since you have gone to such trouble to bring them here tonight, in front of witnesses, perhaps you would not mind explaining exactly how you came to possess private correspondence written to a fiancé you yourself abandoned publicly, humiliating my wife in front of a church full of witnesses months ago. I understand there are several guests present tonight who witnessed that particular display firsthand." Several guests nodded, murmuring confirmation, memories of the church scandal clearly still fresh among those who had been present. Edmund's face reddened as the crowd's sympathy, which he had hoped to turn against Charlotte, began shifting steadily against him instead. Margaret, sensing the plan unraveling, attempted to salvage the moment. "This has nothing to do with tonight's celebration. Perhaps we should simply—" "Perhaps," Alexander interrupted, turning his steady gaze toward his cousin for the first time that evening, "you would like to explain your own involvement in arranging this evening's little performance, Margaret. I understand you met with Mr. Caro on more than one occasion in recent weeks, discussing exactly how best to use those letters against my wife." Margaret's composed expression cracked entirely, replaced by a flash of panic as she realized her private meetings had not remained as private as she believed. "I do not know what you are suggesting," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I am suggesting," Alexander said, "that a household staff loyal to their Duchess tends to notice a great deal and report it faithfully when something troubling is being planned against her." The ballroom had fallen into complete silence now, every guest watching the unraveling scene with rapt attention. Charlotte stepped forward, no longer content to simply stand beside her husband while he defended her. She wanted this time to speak for herself. "I wrote those letters to a man I believed loved me," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily across the silent room. "I have nothing to be ashamed of in that. What should concern this gathering far more is a man who publicly humiliated a woman at her own wedding for financial gain, and then attempted to extort money from her months later using words she wrote in good faith. That, I believe, tells everyone present exactly what kind of character stands before them tonight." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, several guests nodding openly now, their sympathy fully turned against Edmund and Margaret's failed scheme. Someone near the back of the room began to applaud quietly, and within moments the sound spread, until the entire ballroom seemed to stand united against the two conspirators rather than against the woman they had hoped to destroy. Edmund, recognizing the complete collapse of his plan, hesitated only a moment longer before turning and pushing his way through the crowd toward the exit, the letters still clutched uselessly in his hand. Margaret, her face pale with the realization that her scheme had not only failed, but had exposed her own involvement to the entire gathering, offered no further defense before following him out, leaving behind a room full of guests who would speak of little else for weeks to come. Charlotte stood in the center of the ballroom, breathing steadily, watching the two people who had tried to destroy her second chance at happiness disappear from the room in defeat. Alexander turned to her, his expression filled with quiet pride. "You did not need my help at all in the end," he said softly. "No," Charlotte agreed, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "But I am glad you were standing beside me anyway." The orchestra, sensing the moment, began to play again, and slowly the ballroom returned to its earlier warmth, guests resuming their conversations, though now filled with admiration rather than judgment for the Duchess who had faced her past with such quiet strength. Alexander extended his hand toward Charlotte, and she took it without hesitation. "Would you care to dance, Your Grace?" he asked, a warmth in his voice she had come to know well over the past months. "I would like nothing more," Charlotte said. As they moved together across the ballroom floor, surrounded by candlelight and the soft music of the orchestra, Charlotte felt, for the first time since that terrible morning at the church, that she had truly found her place in the world, standing not in someone's shadow, but beside a man who saw her worth clearly, even when the rest of the world had once tried to convince her she had none. In the weeks following the ball, life at Ashford Hall settled into a calm that Charlotte had not known she was capable of feeling again. News of Edmund's failed scheme spread quickly through society, and rather than damaging her reputation, it only strengthened the respect others held for her. Margaret, humiliated by her exposed involvement, quietly withdrew from Ashford Hall altogether, choosing to live with distant relatives rather than face the household staff and family members who now viewed her with open suspicion. Charlotte did not celebrate her cousin's departure, though she felt a quiet relief at the ease that settled over the household in its absence. The staff, freed from years of careful navigation around Margaret's temper, grew warmer still toward their new Duchess, and Charlotte found herself genuinely happy within the walls that had once felt so unfamiliar to her. It was on a quiet evening, several weeks after the ball, that Alexander found her once again in the library, curled into her favorite chair by the fire, though this time she was not reading, simply watching the flames with a thoughtful expression. "You seem lost in thought," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I was thinking about the church," Charlotte admitted. "About how certain I was that my life had ended that morning, standing there in front of everyone, hearing myself called worthless. I could not have imagined, standing on those steps, that I would end up here." Alexander was quiet for a moment, studying her carefully. "Do you regret how it happened? If Edmund had not humiliated you, we never would have met." Charlotte considered the question seriously. "I do not regret where I am now," she said. "Though I will admit, I no longer think of that morning with the same pain I once did. It feels strangely like the beginning of something rather than an ending." "I feel the same," Alexander said quietly. He reached across the space between them, taking her hand gently in his. "Charlotte, I asked you to marry me under practical terms, believing that was all either of us wanted or needed from this arrangement. I find now that what I feel for you has grown into something far beyond practicality." Charlotte's heart quickened at his words, though she remained still, waiting for him to continue. "I love you," Alexander said simply, the words carrying none of the careful distance he had once guarded so carefully around others. "Not out of convenience, not out of obligation, but because you have shown me, every day since that morning at the church, exactly what genuine strength and kindness look like. I did not expect to find this again, not after everything that came before. But I have found it in you." Charlotte felt tears gather in her eyes, though this time they were nothing like the ones she had refused to shed on her wedding day. These were tears of quiet, overwhelming happiness, the kind she had never expected to feel again after being called worthless in front of everyone she knew. "I love you too," she said softly. "I did not expect to, not when we began this. But somewhere between the tea house and this library, between practical arrangements and quiet evenings by the fire, I fell in love with you, Alexander." He rose from his chair and knelt gently before her, taking both her hands in his. "Then let me ask you properly this time, with nothing practical about it. Charlotte, would you renew your vows with me, not as a solution to a scandal, but because I want to spend the rest of my life loving you exactly as you deserve." Charlotte laughed through her tears, nodding as she pulled him close. "Yes," she said. "1,000 times yes." Their second wedding, held quietly in the estate's gardens beneath the last golden light of autumn, bore no resemblance to the disaster that had once defined Charlotte's understanding of what a wedding day should feel like. There were no crowds gathered to witness humiliation, no cruel words spoken in front of judgmental faces. There was only a small gathering of people who genuinely cared for the couple standing together beneath an archway of flowers, exchanging vows built not on obligation, but on a love that had grown slowly and steadily into something unshakable. As Alexander slipped a ring onto her finger, his eyes never leaving hers, Charlotte thought back one final time to the church steps where this entire journey had begun, to the words that had once made her feel worthless, and to the man who had caught her before she fell. She was not worthless. She never had been. She simply had not yet found someone capable of seeing her true value. Now, standing in the golden light of her new life, surrounded by people who loved her genuinely, she finally understood what she had not been able to see on that terrible morning months earlier. Sometimes, the worst days carry within them the beginning of the very best ones. The years that followed brought their own quiet joys to Ashford Hall. Charlotte's gentle influence over the household never faded, and the estate that had once felt cold and unfamiliar became, in time, a home filled with warmth and laughter. Alexander, once known throughout society for his guarded distance, became known instead for the quiet devotion he showed his wife, a transformation that surprised even those who had known him longest. Edmund's family fortunes never recovered from the scandal that followed him after the ball, and his name slowly faded from the circles he had once desperately tried to impress. Margaret remained distant from the family she had once hoped to control, her ambitions quietly forgotten by a society that had moved on to other gossip, other scandals, other stories entirely. Charlotte, in time, became known throughout the region not for the humiliation she had once endured, but for her quiet strength, her genuine kindness toward the estate's staff and tenants, and the steady partnership she shared with her husband. Young women who heard whispers of her story, of the bride called worthless who found her way instead into the arms of a duke, took quiet comfort in knowing that even the worst days did not have to define the rest of a life. And on quiet evenings, when the fire crackled gently in the library and the estate settled into peaceful silence around them, Charlotte and Alexander would often sit together exactly as they had during those early, uncertain weeks of their marriage, though now filled with the easy comfort of two people who had built something real together. Charlotte never forgot the morning she had walked out of that church, certain her life had ended. But she remembered it now not with pain, but with quiet gratitude, understanding at last that sometimes the door that closes behind us opens only because a far better one is waiting just beyond it, ready to welcome us into a life we never could have imagined for ourselves. She had been called worthless once, in front of everyone she knew. She had turned, walked away, and found instead a love built not on convenience or circumstance, but on genuine understanding, patience, and respect. And in the end, that was worth more than anything she had lost that morning on the church steps, more than she ever could have imagined possible on the day her old life quietly, unexpectedly, came to an end.